Joining us now, as we do every Friday, once a week, talking to Michael Greiner, Assistant Professor of Management at Oakland University's School of Business Administration, about everything in the markets and in the economy affecting not just only Michigan, but also the U.S. Michael, thanks for being with us today.
Great to be back, Tyler. Glad to have my power on today.
Yes, yeah, we're all very glad to have it, as over 500,000 from DTE and several tens of thousands others from Consumers Energy out of power, and some at
Pretty
least
crazy.
until Sunday. Yeah, pretty crazy, but also pretty crazy. Still tends to have quite an effect on our economy is the inflation. Now, it's slowing, and there's been plenty of indications that it's continuing to slow. We've talked about this in the past. And the job numbers, generally speaking, have been pretty good, but these both are kind of in conflict with each other. The inflation numbers, the rate of inflation is slowing, and this employment data, and that's concerning some investors. What concerns are they having, and how is that affecting the markets at this time?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Tyler. The problem is this, is that inflation is basically a function of the economy being overheated. So what the Fed is trying to do is basically slow it down. And the tool that they have to do that is by increasing interest rates, basically making it more expensive to borrow money. And they've had some success with this, actually. And you can see this in some of the industries that are particularly sensitive to interest rates. Like, for example, the housing market is in a pretty severe recession right now, actually. And that's largely because mortgage interest rates have gone up to as high as about 6.3%, which is quite a bit higher than we've seen over the last few years. So a lot of people who at one point might have been thinking about buying a new home have decided, no, I'm just going to stick with the home I've got. And that's had a huge impact on the sale of homes, as well as also construction of new homes, and housing starts are down, for example. And similarly, you've also seen an impact, for example, on the auto industry, where people will finance vehicles. And given the cost of vehicles, that cost has basically been pushed down quite a bit as a result of the higher interest rates. Well, the problem is, though, at the same time, you've got the services that are just doing gangbusters. They're doing so well that we had a historic, I can't emphasize this enough, jobs report from last month. This jobs report was absolutely stunning, and we saw the lowest unemployment rate since, I believe, the 1950s, if you can believe it. So this is really stunning. And it was way, way in excess, as much as 3 to 4 times higher than what any economist had predicted. And largely, this is due to the fact that in the services sector, there's still a lot of competition for workers. There are still way more jobs available than there are workers. And as a result, then, what companies have to do is that they have to pay workers more to attract them to their company. And we have all seen this, I'm sure, when we go into a store and there's a long line for one register that's open. Or we go to a restaurant and you've got one waiter or waitress running around trying to serve all the different tables. Well, part of the reason that that's the case is because of the fact that there just aren't enough workers to go around right now for the amount of jobs that there are in the services industry. So what that does is drive up wages there. And what's more, is that unlike in the sale of goods, where a lot of the cost is actually in the the raw materials that are turned into the goods, most of the costs in the services industry are wages. Because literally, it's the people who are doing the work delivering the product to you. So as a result of that, that has been driving up costs. You see really this huge dichotomy when you look at inflation, where if you look at inflation focused on goods, it's actually declined pretty dramatically, almost to the point where the Fed would like to see it. However, when you look at inflation related to services, it's actually been going up still. And that's a big concern. And so despite the fact that last month we did see inflation drop slightly, it didn't drop as much as people had hoped for. This big jobs report, which again, in most circumstances, people would say, oh, this is great news. The problem is it sends this message that maybe the Fed has to do some more raising of interest rates to slow down the economy even more. And that's scary for people right now because you don't know where this is going to stop. Could we get ourselves into a situation where the Fed raises interest rates too high and suddenly we find ourselves in a serious recession? Could happen. Could it be that the Fed does manage to get us into that soft landing where we don't really have much of a recession, but yet inflation rates get under control? Also could happen. And the problem is nobody really knows what's going to happen. We're in this new territory ever since we had the COVID recession. And quite frankly, it's kind of hard to tell. People are trying to read the tea leaves looking at this data. And every time we get new data, it seems to point to some answer that we didn't expect.
And with those job numbers too, so much of what's discussed on the markets and particularly on the job market is there are still all these openings and not enough people to fill them. And some pundits and others that I know I just have conversations with casually about where the economy is at. They mention that the unemployment numbers, and some of them would claim that the unemployment numbers maybe aren't as clear of an indication of what truly is unemployment in our country as they should be, because so many people fell out of unemployment. So how much of a factor is that also in this? And that's not really being talked about a lot, or the number of people that are maybe unemployed and out of work, but haven't been looking for work or have gone through the unemployment system and are no longer being counted, and how that plays into these numbers.
Yeah, that's a great question, Tyler. And that really is like the $64,000 question here, because the fact that, again, we're in this new territory ever since the COVID recession. It used to be that you could look at what's called the labor force participation rate and expect a certain level of participation. And frankly, although the unemployment rate is low now, the labor force participation rate is also lower than you would expect. You see, this is something that a lot of people don't understand, which is that when we talk about the unemployment rate, we're only talking about people who are either working or looking for work. There's this whole other group of people who, for one reason or another, aren't counted as being unemployed. They're either people who are retired, for example, or who are, say, stay-at-home homemakers, or who, for one reason or another, students might not, or might be what we call discouraged workers, where they were looking for a job, but for one reason or another, feel like there really aren't so many options out there that they have the opportunity to find one. Well, what we found as a result of the COVID pandemic is that a lot of people ended up dropping out of the labor force. Many of those people ended up retiring. And it makes sense, because what we have going on right now is the baby boomers, who for so long made up such a huge part of the labor force, are now kind of getting into that retirement age. In fact, I read about 2/3 of them now are older than 65. So that means that a lot of them are saying, maybe I don't want to go back to work anymore. Maybe having been off during this pandemic convinced me that I like being off now and spending time with my family and grandchildren and working in the garden. Who knows? But what we've seen is there's been this decline in labor force participation there. There's also been these weird numbers going on with respect to women, where sometimes the participation is higher for women, sometimes lower. And the expectation is that has a lot to do with the fact that many of the caring duties that people have in families usually fall to women. So where there's childcare, where you need to care for older relatives, those duties are often taken care of by the women in the family. And as a result of that, their participation has gone down at times it's gone up. And then lastly, you have this other issue with young men. Young men, as it turns out, and this is really actually kind of a long-term problem, which some scholars have been looking at, they tend now to be less well-educated than the women. They are less skilled, less well-educated. And what that's led to is kind of this inequality here, where women tend to be, in many respects, more employable in the current economy than men are. And so when you look at the statistics, you see this group of men who have kind of dropped out of the labor force, who don't feel that that there's much of an opportunity for them there anymore. So the question is this: number one, are these people permanently dropped out of the labor force? Have these people, for example, these retirees, decided, I'm done with working, I'm just not going to come back? Or is it possible that they will come back in? Because that can have a big impact. If it means that they could come back in, well, at a certain point here, when wages are raised high enough, they're going to come back into the labor force, and as a result of that, wages will stabilize. On the other hand, if they don't come back into the labor force, there's going to be this competition for a smaller and smaller labor pool that's going to literally drive up the wages until we get to a position where the economy really can't sustain it anymore, or the workplaces kind of adjust to having fewer workers. Could it be through some technology that's happening? I mean, we've all heard about this chat GPT that could have an impact on the number of workers. We've all seen in the grocery stores now how we have the automated checkouts. That certainly could have an impact. I mean, the world is changing right now, and the problem is nobody knows exactly how it's going to change. And you're right about the fact that in the past, we were able to say, oh, labor force participation is low. There's still room for the economy to grow. But now we don't know that because of the fact that we are in kind of this weird era where have they retired or haven't they retired? Well, that's yet to be seen.
It's our weekly market talk with Michael Greiner from Oakland University, Assistant Professor of Management in their School of Business Administration. You can learn more about Oakland University programs, including those in their School of Business Administration at oakland.edu. Michael, also making news across our country right now that could have an impact on our economy because so much of our economy is online is a Supreme Court case that's being overheard at this time that could have a significant impact on the internet, particularly around Section 230. Tell us about that case and a number of different ways that this may impact the internet and therefore impact our economy here in Michigan and around the U.S.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, this is a very, very important case and one that I think everybody should be paying attention to. And I think it's worthy of note that the Supreme Court, when they heard oral arguments on this case, the oral arguments lasted for over 3 hours, which is virtually unheard of. Usually you're talking a half hour at most. But in this case, they wanted to take the time to really explore the different options. And frankly, the different options that were presented to them are pretty scary. What we're talking about here with Section 230 is Section 230 of what's called the Communications Decency Act. And in the 1990s, the question came up of how do you treat these boards or different companies through which content gets distributed? Do we treat them like telephone companies? Like when you pick up the telephone, obviously the telephone company wasn't being held liable for what the people were saying across the telephone. Or do you treat them like newspapers, where the newspaper could be held liable because of the fact that they were essentially determining what was included in the newspaper. And what this law did is it basically said that a lot of these companies should be treated like telephone companies. So that they could not be held liable if somebody posted some crazy stuff on Facebook, for example. Facebook, in theory, wouldn't be able to be sued for that. And that's pretty much the way that this has been interpreted. Now, this case, though, comes up in a tragic situation. What it has to do with is one of the terrorist attacks that occurred in Europe about a year ago. And what happened is that there was an American killed in one of them. And the family of this American student have essentially sued Google, claiming that as a result of the algorithm on YouTube, because of course Google owns YouTube, as a result of the algorithm on YouTube, that it basically made recommendations to people who would be highly influenced by posts regarding ISIS and other radical Islamic philosophies. That it kind of targeted them with videos that would play into those interests and potentially encourage people to engage in violent behaviors. And the argument here is that by having this algorithm, which is created by people, that YouTube is playing a more active role than just kind of being a place that these things get posted. They're being more active than just the telephone company having the information broadcast across the telephone lines. Instead, what they're doing is that they're acting like editors of a newspaper. And they're basically saying, this is the content that should be included, this is the content that should be seen. And as a result of it, these results should potentially open up these companies to liability. And it's interesting to note that in addition to the Google lawsuit, the very next day there was another hearing on a lawsuit targeting Twitter with very similar arguments. So these two lawsuits are kind of going at the same time through the Supreme Court. And the problem is this, is that so much of the internet, as we know, is so huge, and so much of the internet, we rely upon these different sources to kind of curate the data for us. Even Justice Clarence Thomas asked the question of, well, if you're looking for information on cooking, you don't want to find thumbnails about light jazz. And he's right. You want to get recommendations that are kind of attuned to your interests. Well, inevitably, there are going to be some people who have radical views who then these algorithms then are going to deliver to them information and content that kind of is attuned to that. And the Supreme Court, in their case, seemed pretty uncomfortable really with both solutions. On the one hand, they seemed uncomfortable with the idea of putting some kind of liability on YouTube and Twitter and some of these other internet service providers. On the other hand, they seemed uncomfortable with the fact that, hey, they can essentially go around scotch-free making all kinds of recommendations for violent content. So the key point that they seem to be focusing in on as the arguments happened is that this is really an issue that Congress needs to address. And frankly, I was glad to see that, because of the fact that courts really shouldn't be making this kind of decision. When the law was originally passed back in the 1990s, there was an important policy that was set by Congress, which was that people would be able to have essentially unfettered access to the internet and be able to post whatever content they wanted, and that the companies that were essentially enabling that posting wouldn't have to worry about liability as a result of it. Well, that has been called the legislation that led to the creation of the internet. It's been that important. But at the same time now, have things changed? Yes, obviously they have. But within that kind of changing environment, the best positioned body to make a decision as to how things should change in response to that is really Congress, where you have people who are elected by the people and are, as a result, given some authority to make that decision. Judges, you have to remember, aren't elected by anybody, and they're being asked here to essentially create a new interpretation of legislation, which up until now has been fairly settled in how it's been interpreted.
And it's a question of whether or not, particularly on the social media side, whether or not these websites are moderators of this sort of content and these sort of discussions, or if they are publishers of these. And that's another great reason why that argument you make that maybe this should be determined by Congress instead of these courts is so valid, because it's Congress that, by passing these laws, by drafting these laws and ultimately putting them into our Constitution at the federal level and even at the state level as well, determine what those things are, what defines moderator, what defines publisher, and that's going to have a huge part in determining the future of Section 230, passed in 96, and its impact on the internet going forward. Michael, another couple of minutes with you before we'll say goodbye. There's one other really interesting story this week, as we're seeing a lot of layoffs, particularly in technology as of late, but some are saying that these layoffs may not be the best way to go about protecting your business going forward, and it can actually have some detrimental effects on the workforce that remains beyond those layoffs and survives those layoffs.
Yeah, this is, to me, really interesting data, and something where, again, I'm kind of proud of our field that we've done the research on this and been able to provide some data to people. But, there's this expectation somehow that layoffs end up being something that ultimately benefit the company because of the fact that they're becoming more efficient, that they're reducing their workforce, that they're doing a better job of delivering the returns that they're supposed to the shareholders. Well, what the research has found is a couple things. Number one, it's found that typically when companies announce these layoffs, a lot of the time, they don't actually reduce their workforce by much. So, for example, there's one situation where I believe it was Dropbox that had announced a pretty substantial layoff. Well, it turns out that they actually reduced their workforce by less than a fifth of what they had originally announced. Now, that could be due to the fact that they ended up hiring different people, or they ended up basically getting rid of positions that were already vacant. Or it turns out that circumstances had changed. It seems that these companies are making these announcements and then a lot of times not entirely executing on them. Well, as it turns out, that's kind of a good thing, because the other thing that research has found out, and this is pretty conclusive, and it's been tested in any number of ways, and we found it repeatedly to be the case, which is that companies expect that when they lay off employees, they're going to get some kind of improvement in performance. Well, what the data shows is that is not the case. And we've tested this in every which way. I mean, when we look at profitability, when we look at market returns, when we look at the efficiency of the workforce, any way you look at it, layoffs typically do not end up generating better profitability and better performance for the companies. And this is something I think that really is surprising to a lot of executives, because there's almost been this lionization, I think, of executives who take these tough stances. We're going to cut costs by reducing our employee headcount. Well, overall, what we found is it doesn't reduce costs, because as it turns out, you have a couple of things that end up becoming a problem. Number one, you have a lot of the time severance agreements that you need to pay out. And that can be something that ends up being costly to work to the employers. But beyond that, then, you also have kind of harder to quantify things. Like, for example, you might have where you have gotten rid of certain employees. You need to bring in new employees to fill those tasks. And guess what? You have to train them again. So rather than having employees who are efficient and know the jobs, you're bringing in new employees, having to train them. Well, obviously, they have to go through a period of time when they're learning a job, and it takes a while for them to get to the level of efficiency that the people who were laid off were at. So it's costing you more there. Number two, the employees who stay, the employees who remain, a lot of them end up being discouraged and fearful and frequently looking for other jobs. You have to remember, there's this level of trust that employees develop with their employers. And when employees feel that employers have behaved in a way that's unjust and lays people off in a way that's potentially arbitrary and does not make sense to them, then it will dramatically affect their performance. And of course, the most important thing to any company is the ability of their employees to perform. And if the employees are not performing up to their optimum level because they don't feel that level of commitment to the company, well, that's going to be something that ultimately goes down to the company's bottom line. And we've seen that repeatedly in the research. And I really wish that we could get that information out to companies a little more, that this idea of layoffs as a panacea for everything is really not a long-term solution for many of the problems that people point to.
All of this in our economy, very complicated, and we try to simplify it as much as possible, break it down each and every week with Michael Greiner from Oakland University. Michael, thanks as always for joining us.
Great to be here, Tyler. Have a great weekend.